So
Awesome.
We're going to talk about Tim Ferriss and Peter Attia, long, well-known people in the health world, and they're discussing fasting. And Peter is setting up his, rearranging his thinking about fasting and that it's possibly harmful. So here we go.
Anyway, when I looked at these metrics, I was shocked. I was shocked at how much less muscle I had than 10 years earlier, almost exactly 10 years sooner. And, I attribute it to several things, but I really thought that chief among them was just how much fasting I had been doing over the previous 3 years. I had really kind of taken fasting to a pretty extreme place, doing up to 10 days of water only and routinely just busting out 7-day water only fasts. Certainly doing 3 days every month would be, something I would do without hesitation.
When you say 10 days of water only, over what period of time is that?
Meaning like how frequently would I do that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what the cadence was if we take it as a minimum to be.
Probably quarterly.
Got it.
Yeah, probably every quarter. And while I certainly think there are some benefits from doing that, I think what I was sort of confronting was, wow, there's actually a pretty big cost as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go out of my way while fasting to still exercise. I was lifting weights every single day, which was difficult sometimes, but doing everything I could to sort of try to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But at the end of the day, if you're not providing any nutrients, including amino acids, you're basically just tearing down muscle to try to rebuild with that muscle, but your net effect is a loss. So
Jay, what do you think the cost was? And then why do you think his ancestrally consistent worldview did not catch that after 10 years?
Yeah. So there's a couple of really notable things here, as you're saying. So for one, the cost he's discussing is just a loss of muscle, which I think is not catching the entire cost here. The major stress, the depressive effects on thyroid and testosterone and whatnot. I don't know what his experience was and what other things he was doing, but those are inherent effects of fasting. And he's not, in this clip, he's not talking about just intermittent fasting. He's talking about massive fasts, like periods of starvation, 3 days, 10 days, which is crazy. But also, as we'll talk about in another clip, he was also intermittent fasting throughout this entire time. He talks about that just being normal eating to him, is having 2 meals a day in a short window. So yeah, in this clip, he's saying that the main reason why he stopped doing it was because he was recognized 10 years later that he was losing muscle, which is, again, a long time to be doing something that's that damaging. And I think also largely missing the real issue here. And as we'll continue to talk about through these clips, he's focused on, again, it all being muscle centric and trying to do things to prevent muscle loss, like working out. And next clip, he talks about BCAAs. And then later he's talking about protein. And still, I think, completely missing the point, completely missing the harms and costs here of fasting that we'll dig into. But as we go along as well, I think, you mentioned the ancestral point of view, and he discusses in one of these later clips what led him to, this was one of the later clips is when he was fasting. And he explains why it is that he's doing it. And it becomes really clear that his reasoning is not sound. It's not a great place to be working from. And that is, I would argue, what led him to be doing something so damaging for 10 years. And I think is really important when we're looking at anybody, whether it is a major figure in the health sphere or not, is considering their argument for these things. And, it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to recognize that something you were doing was wrong. That's great. We all want to be open-minded, but that doesn't mean we want to, it is reason to be careful following anybody's advice, and why we really want to evaluate critically how they're coming to do the things that they're doing. And as we work through this with Peter Attia and fasting, I think it really highlights that.
My context is usually following the science. What do you guys think about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course.
100%, Danny.
Every time you think low carb or keto or fasting are gone, they circle back around.
Oh, of course.
Every single time.
So what you're referring to, Danny, is when somebody's changing their mind all the time, and they're just essentially, there's a difference between having an experience like fasting multiple, quarterly, doing long fast quarterly, and doing intermittent fasting daily, and then looking at your actual data and seeing that after 10 years of doing this and working out religiously and making sure you're eating enough protein, all type of stuff, you have actually lost muscle mass. When you have data like that and you can see that, if you ignore that you can't ignore that. If you have any degree of rational thinking, you cannot ignore that. And so in Peter Attia's circumstance, it's like he has to now change how he thinks about this particular thing because the data and the real life experience has told him that his theory is incorrect. The problem is that the frame with which he's going about thinking about this, instead of changing how he's looking at the picture and looking for a broader context to understand why this isn't correct, he's just shifting over the content. And so in certain circumstances with certain people inside the health sphere, you see they jump from repeat to vitamin D is a toxin to Morley Robbins stuff, and then back to low carb and all these types of things. This person is not learning. This person is just shifting from one thing to the next. He's not actually learning how to think about these things. They're not diving deep into the information and getting a real grasp of it and figuring out where the nuances are and where the problems are and why this piece doesn't make sense, and then testing it out and seeing real world information. So they don't actually get a learning process. They're not testing out their theories or their perspectives, and they're not looking at real world. They're just that something doesn't work. They're not fully in, they like jumped in, something doesn't work, and then they switch because it's not working instead of figuring out the process. And that's like the lowest level, I would say, of thought processes overall. And I don't mean that in a subjective way. I mean that objectively. In the next tier, you have something with like what Peter Attia is doing, where he's forced to see that his perspective or his theory is not working. Instead of trying to adjust the perspective, and perhaps the wheels are starting to turn, I don't know. But instead of like fully adjusting the perspective, he's just kind of switching the content around fasting. Like, okay, well, fasting doesn't work because it's catabolic to muscle tissue. The question is, will he expand the way he's thinking about these things into the next context? And so then that's kind of a mid-level. And another layer you can see is like you have a change in the content, and you can shift content when something doesn't work. But then you can also say, like, is the frame with which I'm thinking about these things correct? That is like an evolution of your thought processes. Instead of moving in a lateral plane, you're moving vertically in terms of your ability to think about something. Whereas in these other spheres, the lowest one, I don't even know what's going on over here. It's just like this kind of schizophrenic way of going about things. And then the middle level is kind of moving horizontally around the information that you're thinking about.
You can make lots of money on that low level, though. So,
yeah. Just to clarify too, Mike, what you're saying, so experience is really important, but we don't want to just go around testing every single possible dietary iteration as if they all could be equally right, because we're easily swayed by weak arguments. So it's great that Peter Attia had a bad experience and looked at it, but the fact that he was doing it in the first place based on very faulty reasoning, and that it took him 10 years while he was recommending it the entire time, is not something to look up to. That is
no. I mean, I think it's a good thing that he's actually open to shifting his frame about this stuff and actually publicly discussing it. Now, should it take 10 years? Probably not. But I guess there's an individual element. Also, before you go and jump into something, actually vetting it appropriately and discerning it is really powerful. But to learn that, you also have to kind of go through it a little bit. Because for us, that's what we went through, right? We went through a period of time where we were trying to discern what makes sense and testing things out. And then after you get burned a little bit, you start to learn.
Yeah, we're all guilty of that, being obsessed with the idea that's not true.
Yeah.
Okay, let's to hear him talk about BCAAs.
I'm glad you brought up the leucine, lysine, and methionine, because I was going to ask earlier if while you were fasting but losing lean muscle mass over time, you were supplementing with, say, branched chain amino acids in any fashion.
I used to always drink BCAAs during workouts. And for folks listening, there are 3 branched chain amino acids. And, leucine is hands down the most relevant of them. And we know from work that our mutual friend David Sabatini has done in his lab that, leucine is a very, very potent mTOR stimulator. In fact, it might be the single most potent stimulator of mTOR. mTOR, of course, acutely, you want that thing stimulated. It's promoting growth. You don't want it chronically stimulated, but you want it acutely stimulated.
What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much to add. It's just, I wanted to make sure we had that part in, because in the next one as well, he talks about this idea that it's all just about protein. And if you have enough protein while you're fasting and you eat enough protein while fasting or while intermittent fasting, you're okay. But obviously, at the very least, the BCAAs weren't enough to prevent, considerable muscle loss for him. But I don't have too much else to add there. I just wanted to include that little piece.
Aren't the BCAAs insulinogenic? And so couldn't they like lower his blood sugar more, making the stress more intense?
Yeah. I mean, working out while fasting, I think, is a pretty bad idea as well. And he was talking about how hard it is. It's like the main cost of fasting is this major stress, and you're driving that harder. And if it did maintain muscle mass, or the amount of muscle mass it did maintain, that is taking that much more energy from every other bodily system. That's even worse. Like, you're maintaining muscle mass at what cost to your brain, to your liver, to your kidneys, to your reproductive function. I mean, we'll get into it, because he talks about later how fasting increases epinephrine. That's a good thing, and that's why we should be fasting. When we go back to his earlier reasoning, he was aware of that, but there's no consideration that stress is actually harmful and comes at a cost. Yes, BCAA is not enough to prevent muscle loss, and as you said, yes, insulinogenic, just to add to the stress that he's already under.
Before you go, Danny, I want to add something here. Is that so? This is actually something that I hear a lot from like some of the young guys that I work with. It's like, oh, I'm gonna like take BCAAs to stimulate mTOR. What I want to put into context with people here is that while BCAAs stimulate mTOR is a signaling cascade. So you also need other amino acids to actually like grow the tissue. Like it's not just like leucine will grow it by itself. So actually having enough protein is important overall. But the piece with the fasting stuff is that you're fasting plus you're working out, and like these aren't small fasts. Like no amount of signaling for growth is going to overcome the level of catabolism that you put yourself in when essentially, like, people, we talk about caloric deficits or something like that. A 7-day fast is a massive caloric deficit. Like, I don't even, like, you have 0 calories for 7 days straight. The level of catabolic processes that you upregulate in that time frame, especially if you're doing it quarterly, and then you're doing 3-day fasts at other times, and then you're doing intermittent fasting on other days, is insane. It's absolutely an insane level of catabolism to be functioning on a regular basis. And people will be like, oh, well, the body has all these mechanisms in place that you can, will stop you from losing muscle tissue and all these backup pathways. It's like, yeah, you're slowing down your metabolism so that you don't shred all your lean mass to make glucose, and you don't shred all your fat mass really fast so that you die. So it's like, that is not what you want to optimize for, slowing the system down so that you can function at like the lowest level of subsistence because of some arbitrary pathway about fasting. And then turn around and be like, oh yeah, I lost some muscle doing this. It's like, there's way more things that probably went on besides just muscle loss overall.
This is just speculation. And we're kind of saying like, why would anybody stick to something that was so harmful, But my interpretation of Peter Attia is he's pretty type A. And so he might have kind of stuck to this for energy. You know what I mean? Like, he might have been running on the stress, and maybe if he stopped at some point, that was, he would slow down. And so again, not like, oh, what idiot would stick to this fasting thing? He might have interpreted it as like a positive type of thing, that he could get everything he needed to do done. I'm sure he has a busy schedule, and sometimes you get caught in that, you get quantum looped, and your health suffers for that. But,
well, and he alluded to that too in the last clip about like why he's going into fasting and talking about the epinephrine making him sharper and like better. I mean, of course we'll get there, but it's like, yeah, he needs it to function. Like, he is totally running on stress hormones. Yeah.
Being on adrenaline is like the opposite of functional. Like my experience with adrenaline is like, you can't listen to somebody. So they'll be talking, but you'll be having a conversation in your head that inhibits you from even understanding what they're saying. And I know the feeling very well. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that you should be able to be in a state where you can actually function while eating. So that, I know this is like a foreign concept in some of these spheres, but like, once in my experience, like the fasting thing is legit. Like I remember when I was in college and I was fasting in the mornings, and then I'd eat my first meal at like 12 or 1. In the morning, I'd be super productive. But I also, when I was doing that in low carb, I couldn't sleep. I was sweating all the time. I was anxious, and I was always cold. Hands and feet were cold. So like, was it productive for that? Yes. But once you dial the diet in the right way, and you kind of get things organized, appropriately, you should be able to eat carbs and protein and fat and like have an actual meals and still be able to function. So like that for me, that was one of the gauges that I determined for myself or like set for myself when I started to get better with this stuff and figured the different pieces out. Was like, oh wow, I can actually wake up and have this, have a bunch of fruit and juice and this different protein source. And I actually still like, I get work done, but now I'm just not a sweaty, anxious nightmare. And I actually slept 8 hours straight last night. So it's like, there is a way to function appropriately while still eating and not having to optimize for those stress hormones.
It's such a good point, Mike. It's looked at as a badge of honor, right? So a couple things. One is being able to skip meals and not have a good appetite and everything is looked at as a good thing. And being able to perform and not have food get in the way of your life. Like those things are looked at as optimal outcomes. And he alludes to this and talks about this in other clips that we didn't include here, where I think he was talking with Joe Rogan and was talking about how active he is and how much muscle he has. And Joe was like, wow, you must have a really strong appetite. He's like, I did a long time ago, but not really anymore. I just skip meals and, I don't eat that much. And as you said, I mean, a 7-day fast, if let's say his caloric needs, so to speak, are like 3,000 calories a day, we're talking about 21,000 calorie deficits. Like this is insanity. And as in the way that, as you were discussing, Mike, you are forcing that metabolic dial to go way down in order to maintain function, in order to survive, in order to live. And that means turning down thyroid activity. It means turning down testosterone. It means turning down cognitive function, turning down digestive function, everything. And then you need the stress hormones to be able to perform, to be able to like exist and think, because that metabolic dial is so low, you've tanked your metabolism. And again, he talks about this, how you need the epinephrine and norepinephrine to make you sharper and, be able to function.
We know that we want to eat in a way to minimize stress hormones like cortisol while maximizing our metabolism. But when it comes to creating a diet to do so, there's a lot of conflicting information out there. And that's why I've created the Energy Balance Food Guide to help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The Energy Balance Food Guide is a one-page infographic that organizes foods on a spectrum based on how effectively they support your metabolism, and it also has a separate spectrum that adjusts this scale for you in the case that you're dealing with various digestive symptoms. This food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health. So head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide.
Yeah, I think shifting that narrative around this being a badge of honor to eat less, to skip meals, and instead to shift it toward, I can eat twice as much as I used to and maintain my weight and feel really good after I eat and be able to focus and be able to function and sleep and not be anxious and be able to think clearly. And as you were saying, Danny, like not get stuck in your own thoughts and like not be able to have a legitimate interaction with somebody. I think those should be the badges of honor. And I hope that at some point that narrative starts to shift. But yeah, obviously it's nowhere near as sexy when you have to like prepare a meal all the time, or you have to bring snacks with you when you leave the house, as opposed to just saying like, hey, I got by, fasting the whole day and I was totally fine. And plus I activated autophagy. So, cleaning up all my damaged tissues. So,
well, very, very well said. Okay. So let's get to these this is a Joe Rogan one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You got to understand.
Do you want to do the other one first, Jay, or do you want us to do
the other one?
Yeah, do the other one first, because the Joe Rogan one is like the old version of what led him to the thought process in the first place, which I think is it just illustrates exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, this other one is still talking about his new views of fasting. Okay. So
there's no magical benefit of time restricted feeding in terms of the impact on body weight beyond the caloric deficit. But the problem is, on average, people lose more muscle because they're restricting protein more.
So what if there's a woman that does have muscle? Would you say to go to intermittent fasting, or would that still be sort of last on your list?
I guess it depends how big a fasting window she's talking about and whether she's willing to maybe have a protein shake outside of the fasting window. If you could just get a little bit of protein in, let's just say she says, okay, fine, I'm only going to eat between 2 and 8. If you could have a protein shake at 9 in the morning and then have a protein lunch at 2 and then a protein dinner at 8, I would say that would be worthwhile. And just make sure that that protein shake that you're having in the morning is very otherwise low in calories.
Peter sounds like he's aping Ted Naiman now.
Yeah, I have one thing to say, and it's protein.
Yeah.
This defeats the reason of why they discuss fasting in the first place, right? It's like we're fasting because we want to lower mTOR because lowering mTOR has this benefits in longevity and all this type of stuff. And then it's like, but we don't want to lose muscle mass. So we're going to have a bunch of amino acids that likely stimulate mTOR in the fasting window and all these types of things. It's like, I remember when I was first coming to fasting, the number one thing was like, don't have something that stimulates insulin or mTOR in your fasting window. So it's like, you can have coffee, you can have green tea, you can have water, but God forbid you have a carbohydrate. God forbid you have like something that had dairy, or God forbid you had a protein source, especially BCAAs. Like, you are going to minimize the longevity benefits, the health benefits of fasting beyond the caloric restriction piece. So now it's like this soft shift where it's like, oh, the only benefits of fasting, and he specifically said for weight loss, is caloric restriction. And this is known. Like, researchers have been saying this in different papers consistently, is that fasting just makes it easier for a lot of people to eat less. That's essentially it. But then the long-term, besides the mTOR stuff, besides that being kind of like, I don't know, hypocritical or paradoxical, like to start changing the guidelines like this, there's still this complete lack of understanding of part of the catabolic process is up-regulating stress hormones. Like, it's cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, all these types of things. Like, this is still not being talked about. And I have a sneaky suspicion that we give it, a couple more months, and then maybe a year, maybe a couple of years, whatever the deal is. And then that conversation will start being brought into the picture. And it's like, oh, there's this guy, Hans Selye, and he was talking about how stress is cumulative. And it's like, so maybe we shouldn't just be like optimizing for all of these stressful things on a consistent basis. And we're still not having that argument here. And I think that is actually the big base overall. And that is even beyond just like the catabolic effects on muscle tissue. It's talking about the other effects on the systems overall. So yeah, it's a soft shift, but it's still missing the overall point.
Totally missing the point. So fasting is not equivalent of calorie restriction. And the reason why people have worse effects for fasting is not because they're just consuming less protein. So in the studies where they look at, diets that have the same number of calories, but one has a time restricted window and the other doesn't, the time restricted window loses about the same weight, and they lose way more muscle mass and less fat mass. And that's because the catabolic situation, first off, is not just due to the amount of calories coming in, but it's actually due to the timing. It's due to not eating consistently. And it's not due to not having protein consistently. If you actually wanted to prevent the catabolic state, you would have carbohydrates, right? Who was talking about how they were going to start using glucose to prevent the catabolic effects of fasting, but still get some supposed benefits? It was one of the biohackers. And again, just totally missing that what's happening here is when you don't have the carbohydrates available consistently, blood sugar drops, stress hormones kick in to produce the glucose and shift over to fatty acid oxidation. And that's inherently catabolic. It's not only going to destroy muscle tissue, but also is going to downregulate your metabolic state, because those same stress hormones, glucagon, adrenaline, cortisol, downregulate thyroid activity and conversion and production, downregulate testosterone production, all of those things cause massive issues. And so, yeah, I think, again, this highlights that even though there's been a shift into fasting perspective, where we recognize that there's some negatives there, we still have no concept, and by we, I mean Peter Attia, has no concept of what's actually causing the problems here. Totally missing the point.